Pleased to welcome Joe Sorochinsky, who is a member of our association, and Joe is our keynote speaker today. Joe came to George Brown in 1987, first working in what was then the Community Outreach Department. She had a variety of roles in that area as chair of the department and subsequently as dean of the Access and Academic Studies Division. In 1997, she went on to work for the college system provincially, so continuing to work for our collective behalf. Jo will talk with us today about her recent book, Dancing with My Father, and you just saw the book cover on the slide. We've asked Jo to focus her talk today on the process of researching, writing, and publishing her book. We know that some of our members are writing books or thinking about writing books, and we probably all sometimes wonder about how a book we've read came together. Jo will be back with us in April at an open book club meeting for a talk that will center on the content of the book. So while these things overlap, of course, today we'll focus more on the process of the book, and then in April, there will be an opportunity to hear more about the content of the book. We hope to have a little time for questions at the end of Jo's presentation today, so if you would please hold any questions or comments until then, we'd appreciate it. Jo, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Georgia, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here as well. And I did have a bit of a gulp when I realized I was the entertainment. Maybe I should have worn a hat or something. But anyway, that not being, I know we're all sitting for a very long time. Perhaps we're a little out of practice with it these days. So I won't go on too long, but as Georgia says, it's the process of writing that we're going to focus more on today. And I've chosen to read my preface because I think that it's probably as good a starting point as any. By the time I was 6, I knew I was Irish and Catholic. I'd lived all my life in Ireland. My mother, Noreen, was Irish. I thought my father, Anne, was too. Both were Catholic. After we moved to Canada when I was 7, I added Canadian. A few years later, I expanded my identity to include Austrian after learning that Anne was born in Vienna. When I was around 17, I began to suspect my Irish ancestry held the Jewish measure, but Anne shrugged off my questions about it. He was born and raised a Catholic. That was the end of the story. For him. It wasn't for me. His refusal to talk about his heritage only fueled my resolve to unearth it. But he was as determined to keep it hidden as I was to know it. My mother didn't enlighten me. I think she believed the story was not hers to divulge. So I started digging. Over the years, I uncovered painful and shameful family secrets. And the horror of the Holocaust hit closer than I had ever imagined. Had I known that neither Anne's nor I would ever be the same again, I'm not sure I would have persisted. Dancing with My Father is the story of my quest, the story of what the Nazis did to my ancestors, and the story of how they upended the teenage Anne's life in 1938 Vienna, when they classified him as Jewish. He and his maternal aunt were two of the 117,000 plus Viennese Jews who escaped the final solution. Among the thousands who remained, 47,550, including his parents, Mary Ann and Hugo, were deported to ghettos in German-occupied Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where they were shot or starved to death. Thousands more were deported to concentration camps and killed in Nazi gas chambers, as his paternal grandmother was. Still others starved or were killed in euthanasia experiments, like his paternal aunt. As I probed into Anne's past, I searched for stories like his, stories of assimilated Jews who didn't know or had turned away from their Jewish heritage until the Nazis turned them back. I read hundreds of nonfiction accounts and novels on the Holocaust. Sometimes I found a book or article that echoed parts of Anne's story, but none were just like his. After forcing myself to sift through photographs and watch videos and movies of the roundup, deportation, death trains, ghettos, and gas chambers, I saw that when our survival is threatened, we are capable of the unspeakable. We cut ourselves off from our essence as human beings. We watched the genocide and slaughter of millions of people taking place again and again throughout the world while we stay silent and look away. We save ourselves by rendering the victim as other. In every photo and every video, I searched for a face I might recognize from Anne's family album. Maybe the childhood hours my brothers and I had spent working on jigsaw puzzles sustained me in my search to piece together the puzzle of his past. Slowly, I began to unearth a fragment here, another there. I wasn't sure where they fit or whether I'd ever have enough to put together a complete picture, but still, I kept at it. As I grappled with the fragments, I began to understand why Anne was so determined to put the past behind him. It was the only way he knew how to survive. It was the only way he knew to keep my brothers, Brendan and Adrian, and me from hating. He'd seen too much of what hate had done to him and his family. My search took a toll on both Anne and me, yet we persisted, each in our own way. As much as he tried to keep the past behind him, it still affected our family. When Brendan and Adrian were in their 20s, they changed their surname. Decades later, Anne's took that name for himself. Anne's was 74 when Austria finally accepted its role in the Holocaust and offered restitution to surviving victims or their heirs. As the nation worked its way through the process, Anne's began to face the time he'd wanted to forget. His wife, Noreen, had died by then. His parents, Marianne and Hugo, were long gone. He took his ghosts on alone. In 2008, a biography of his father was published, which unmasked some of the family history. A few years later, a book detailing the experiences of Germans seeking refugees in Ireland revealed his. Both books informed my own. Hard as it was to piece together Anne's history, writing it was harder. For years, people had urged me to write it, but the spark that ignited Dancing with My Father was his request that I edit Life Tale, the autobiography he wrote for the family when he was 85. After decades of refusing to disclose his history, he laid much of it bare in Life Tale. It became my guide into his past, a book that fleshed out episodes he'd only partially disclosed during 2 trips we made to Austria. It corrected old stories, exposed old lies, and ushered in new ones. It introduced relatives, living and dead, filled in some blanks, led me down dead ends, and occasionally through curveballs of truth. What I hadn't counted on was how memory can warp the past and how a traumatized survivor may have bent it to a bearable shape, leaving me to untangle a knot that had tightened over decades. There were times when the horror of the Holocaust hit too close and I stopped writing. Many mornings after a nightmare night, I told myself I didn't have to do this. until I realized I did. What drove me on was my sense of owing it to those family members who had been murdered to tell their story and track down what had happened to them. I owed it too to Anne. For all his efforts, he could not escape the Nazi years. For decades, he managed to bolt the door on the past, only for it to burst open and spew fear, pain, and guilt over its final years. Adrian and Brendan didn't share my passion to know more about our heritage, yet I could never have written this book without them. Each held pieces of the family puzzle and worked with me to place them where we thought they fit. Through dancing with my father, I came to appreciate how differently children can experience the same event and how these shape them in unique ways. I also came to realize how subjective memory is and to understand that the lies my father told me weren't all deliberate. He had no siblings to set him straight. As George has said, one of the things that we're focusing on here is how I came to write this and the kind of things that the writing of it taught me, perhaps changed previous ideas either I had or my father had told. So my next selection is just a bit about the first visit I made to Austria, particularly at Vienna in 1990, and hearing some of the stories contradicted by the storyteller himself, my father. Oh, I see that's not the place I'm jumping to, so I will get to that page. Okay, so this is my father, my mother, and me. We had just visited the high school my father had attended, and now we're on to the university, the Technical University of Vienna. We continued on to his second alma mater, the Technical University of Vienna. Moments after staring at a white building in silence, he shook himself as if a mild current was coursing through his brain. He wandered off just as I was asking about his classes and stood under the shade of a giant tree in the Karlskirche church, kneading his chin the whole time. His steps were quick and firm as he returned to us. Well, he replied, as if there'd been no interruption. Actually, I didn't go. I didn't attend university. But your engineering degree's from here, I said. It was not a question. Yes, well, no. I never said I completed my degree. I always explained to people what happened, that because of the war, my education was interrupted when I left Vienna. Interrupted when I left? His word echoed those carved into the high school plaque. Perhaps understatement is endemic to the Viennese. He kept his eyes on the building as Noreen and I stepped closer to hear him. I did attend a few lectures at the beginning of September, he said. The engineering faculty had accepted me after all. But it was 1938 and I felt uncomfortable. Because in September 1938, the government had declared him Jewish. Like all Jews, he was not welcome. I examined photos of students linking their arms across the entrance steps to the University of Vienna in 1930. Young men with huge grins stretch a banner between them, declaring that no Jews are allowed. The institution's anti-Semitism was well established long before the march of the Nazis. The Technical University was no different. I would say hello to friends, Anne said. They would turn their backs and walk away from me. They wouldn't talk to me, so I stopped going. I studied on my own. but all the books. I did it on my own. I longed to comfort the young man who seemed so close to the surface in the aging man, the young man who always wanted to fit in. It wasn't hard to picture him sitting alone at home, his silky dark hair falling into his dark eyes as he took solace from textbooks whose smell of newness soothed like a balm of objectivity in a world pitching to chaos. I lost myself in my book, and that it helped push the unpleasantness away. Whenever I asked how the unpleasantness had touched him, his response never varied. Lots of books have been written about this, he said. Read about it if you're interested. I did, but I was after more. I wanted to be able to see how his, Marianne and Hugo's, everyday lives up before had changed when the Nazis struck. I never did. We left the grounds in silence, one of the few times no one said a word. Noreen and I walked on either side of him as if to help shoulder the burden of pain and humiliation visible on his face. As I lay in bed that night, his shifting stories began to make more sense to me. How could he tell me about the days of 1938 and 1939 when he couldn't face them himself? He had turned his back on them, forcing himself to think ahead, to focus firmly on a promising future. He handed me versions he could live with, ones that didn't torment him. Anne dealt with the trauma of living in Vienna under Nazi rule by constructing a past he could live with, shaping it according to the dictates of the moment, to bolster an ego, satisfy a questioner, or impress a stranger. Without siblings to contradict his version of the past, he fashioned it into something bearable, filling his brain's pathways with tailored accounts until he could no longer differentiate between what had happened and what he wished had happened. In the end, isn't that what we're left with? Memories that survive the erosion of old age, be they real or imagined. They enabled him to go on. I guess now maybe one more moment for a short reading. Georgia, sound okay? Okay. So this is recalling the moment that actually started this book's beginning. During one of my visits to his retirement residence, the aroma of Viennese coffee blended with the promise of spring slipping through a window he had just cracked open. Stay there, he said. There's something I want to show you. He laid a 3-ring binder whose once clear plastic cover was now yellowed and cracked with age on the table before us. Life's Tale. I had read excerpts earlier, but this was the first time I saw the completed work. I want you to have a go at editing this, he said. I flipped through 162 pages, then unnumbered, all single-spaced, and in 10-point type. At least he left the back of each sheet blank, providing a clear slate on which I could scribble his answers to the questions his story raised in me. Of course, I'd love to, I answered. Our telephone editing sessions began some weeks later. I thought my suggestions were minor. No, he'd say, that's not it at all. You're changing it. I wrote it that way because I drummed my pen, red of course, in irritation on the bar counter. On we went for minutes, broken by long sighs at both ends. Calling it quits was the one thing we both agreed on. As I put the receiver back a little too firmly, my husband Frank approached with a glass of red wine, a large one, at 4 p.m. He doesn't want you to edit it, Frank said. Just tell him how good it is. So I talked with him and read his story, this time paying no attention to grammatical errors, awkward phrasing, and typos. For decades, I had accused him of denying his background, and he volleyed back that I had it all wrong. Lifetale showed me he was right. I did have it all wrong. Baptized at 2 months and raised as a Catholic by his converted parents, Anne had always been a Catholic until the Nazis declared him a Jew. Opinions and axioms I had believed idiosyncratic to him. Ignore what you don't want to see and it will go away. Guard secrets within the family. Trust no one outside the family. Prejudice against uneducated people is not really prejudice. They were all well nurtured in the Horowitz home, as were reverence for education, reading, science, innovation, hiking, and the arts, especially music. For years, I'd pushed books at him, the history of Jews in Vienna before, during, and after the Holocaust. Books filled with women and men who had died in the Holocaust. Accounts of people who survived the camp, and accounts of people like him who had escaped. Interesting, he'd say as he handed back the latest book. In our family, interesting was the kiss of death. For any food, art, music, book, or idea that didn't quite measure up. But of course, that's not my story at all. I was baptized, and so were my parents. We were Catholic, all of us, Catholic. Everyone knew I was Catholic. Hang on, I'd argue. Both your parents were born and lived as Jews for years. Your father was a Jew almost as long as he was a Catholic, your mother longer. And what about your aunts, Fritzi and Elsa, and Ignaz and Miriam Merriman, Simon and Eugenie Horwitz, your grandparents? What about them? You knew from the documents you found in your mother's death that they were all members of Vienna's Jewish community. They were Jews, your whole family, Jews. My Jews and his Catholic ricocheted between us for months. He was well aware that 4 Jewish grandparents made not only his parents, but him a Jew to the Nazis, as I too now knew. Everyone did not know you were not Jewish, I insisted. In fact, it was the opposite. After March 1938, everybody knew you were. His eyes would drift to the view framed within its picture window as if to draw patience from its tree's tranquility. Leaves unfurled green from tight buds, turned gold, and fell in drift through a number of cycles as on we talked and argued. Why hadn't I cut him some slack, this old man who suffered so much? I cringe now to recall how he sucked in air stale by our exchanges. What had I wanted from him? It seemed so simple at first. I wanted to know his past, what had happened to him and his parents, and who he was. Later it came to me. I wanted more. I wanted him to accept his past, his Jewish past. I wanted him to acknowledge that his parents, his grandparents, his aunts, and all those who lost their lives or had been forced into exile like him had paid the price for the heritage he would not own. To say that what happened to him and to them happened because they were Jews. I wanted him to embrace and feel proud of his Jewish ancestry. I wanted his shame to end. I wanted his guilt to end. I wanted his fear to end. And I wanted to know who I was. So maybe I'll leave it there, Georgia. You need to unmute.
Indeed, I do.
Nope, didn't work.
There we are. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. In thinking about telling stories about one's family, there is always the question of both transparency and wanting to be, there are all these questions because family history is long, where do you start? Where do you stop? And you, in fact, would go quite far back in where to start in order to have the context of your father's family's life. And then similarly, what do you reveal? What do you withhold? How did you decide how revealing you wanted to be about yourself, how revealing you wanted to be about other family members, particularly those who were still alive? How did you negotiate those questions?
Well, it wasn't really very difficult because I don't know if any of you have thought about writing a memoir or have in fact started one. But if you're going to start a memoir, it's all about talking about yourself and your family. So there wasn't all that much really that I thought about. The one thing that I was careful about was I didn't want to do harm. I didn't want to present my father as somebody he wasn't, or like all adolescents, I'd argue with about a number of things throughout my adolescence and well beyond. But what kept me on path really was the parts to tell that would move my story forward. I was trying to talk about a man who at the age of 75 was still so burdened and damaged by his past that he changed his surname. Lots of people did it if they came as immigrants to a new country, and people would look and just not be able to deal with a whole bunch of consonants in particular, and so would change their name. But it was still a pretty unusual thing for somebody, even as old as my brothers, because they both changed their names when they were in their 20s. He never worried about me because it was accepted in those days that a woman getting married mostly would change their name, although I don't think either of us counted on just how many times I would go through that. But as I say, it wasn't really something I spent a lot of thought about. The part that did cause me to stop and check with my editor was there is a point when my father left Vienna in 1939. He was on his way to the US where a cousin had sponsored him. At that point, things were getting much worse. The Nazis were closing things down more and more. So the aunt in the US said, just get him out now, get him anywhere that he will be safe, and wait for the final affidavit to come through before he leaves for the US. And he ended up in Ireland. Very few people trying to escape actually ended up in Ireland, but he was one of the very fortunate ones. And his very first night in Tralee, where I was born, he had been given, I won't say refuge, he'd been in Ireland a couple of months by that point, but he had been given a place to stay, and he was what we would now call sexually assaulted by his host. And I wasn't sure that I should name this host. And after discussing with my editor, she said, he's dead. He didn't have any children. This happened. It's authentic to what happened. It's fine. What I didn't know and came as a surprise was when I launched my book in March, a number of my Irish relatives were listening. And I read the passage of my father's sexual encounter, let's say, with this individual. And I used his name. I later found out there was a whole ripple of shock that went through the Irish relatives because it turned out that this Jimmy Enright had been their father's best friend. And while they knew or suspected that Jimmy was gay, never crossed their father's mind, and certainly the idea that he would have done something like this to my father would have hurt their father deeply. He absolutely adored my father, and it would have been a real shock. So there were moments like this, not very many of them, but a few. I do name a young woman that, as I wrote again in my book, my father was always attracted to attractive women, and he had been corresponding with this woman in Vienna for some time. And when my brothers and I went back in 2006 with him, when his father was given recognition by the Technical Museum of Vienna, we were all just groaning, oh my God, we're going to meet Sabina, and let's hope he doesn't make a total idiot of himself. And we're all crossing our fingers. Maybe she's going to be this person that will be not attractive to him in any way. Of course, she was totally, in every sense of the word, a beautiful woman. And everything proceeded as we would expect. So I thought again about naming her, and I did try and get in touch with her, and I gave the passage that I had written about to her. I never heard back from her. She had been working then at what was known as the Holocaust Victim Support and Information Center. It no longer exists because it had been established to deal with some of the repercussions that had occurred after Austria instituted an art restitution act. So there was no way I could get in touch with her. But again, I felt it was important to the picture I was trying to give of my father, and some of his quirkiness, perhaps, which made him the fascinating, remarkable man that he was.
Could you talk a little bit about the writing process itself, drafts, feedback you got from other writers, neat stuff that wound up on the cutting room floor, organizing all of this massive information into a readable manuscript?
Well, I can tell you, I had a lot more hair when I started. It absolutely drove me crazy. I would often come to Frank in the morning and just say, why did I ever think I could write a book? I can't do this. It's too hard. I don't know where to start. I don't know where this is going. I always loved research, so I often spent a lot more time on research than I probably needed to. And I think it provided me a way just to keep working. And that was something I had decided when I started the project, that no matter what happened, I was going to sit at my desk and just do some work on it every day. I think it's very common, according to my editor, it's very common for a beginning writer to include way too much information. So the first draft that I sent her, poor soul, was 125,000 words. And the next one was 75. So there was a lot that ended up on the floor. Now, luckily, I don't know what the technical term for the opposite of a hoarder is, but I am that. So I throw stuff out and then think, oh God, why did I do that? So at a certain point, I stopped throwing things out because at one point I decided what I try to do is I would talk about what was happening in Europe and I would talk about what was happening in Ireland at the same time, and then try and weave together this story of my parents. Well, that drove most of my readers, who were my friends for the most part, a number of them writers, saying, yeah, I don't know where I am. Like, you're here and you're there, and then you're doing this and you're doing that. And so finally, I was convinced that that was another story. My mother, Ireland, and I'm actually working on it at the moment. But I threw out stuff I shouldn't have, but I luckily stopped at a certain point. So I have a lot more than I would have had my usual tendency to get rid of things. I actually blame my father for this because he felt a lot of the reason his parents didn't get out was that his father didn't want to leave things like his treasures, his books. And there's a permanent exhibit of his books in the Technical University of Vienna. And I just shake my head sometimes and think, this is the legacy of this man's life. But I'm sure he'd be delighted to know that his books and his papers are there. And so maybe I gained some of this urge to write, honestly. I think, Georgia, I said to you at one point, it wasn't until we're talking about some of the questions that I might answer that I realized I came from writers on both sides of my family.
Yeah.
I have an Irish uncle who wrote and published poetry. I can't read a word of it because it's all in Irish. So I think there's a pretty small audience there for that. But my mother's family had a newspaper, a very small newspaper in Kerry in Ireland. So there, I guess I can't escape it. And most days I'm quite happy with it, but there are days I absolutely damn it. Because it's a hard.
So you went from having a manuscript to actually having a book. Tell us about finding a publisher and getting published.
Well, that was a fairy tale, if ever there was one. On the days where it would drive me nuts to keep writing or editing or whatever, I started Googling thinking about, I need to find a publisher for this. I hadn't originally thought about publishing it, but a number of people, both in the family and outside, encouraged me to do it. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll give it a go. So I started Googling, and it was really discouraging because all the Canadian publishers would say not accepting unsolicited manuscripts and won't take anything at the moment. If you haven't already published a book, we won't even look at you. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe what I need is an agent. I wasn't quite sure what an agent did, so I had to figure that out. Then I found the top 10 Canadian agents. Well, it was exactly the same thing. Not accepting any unsolicited. How do you get anything published if you haven't already? So it was out of frustration one day, I just sat on my computer and I wrote, who publishes Holocaust manuscripts or books? And boom, up pops this Amsterdam Publishers. And of course, Amsterdam. Now, I had no illusions that they would publish me. But what hooked me and convinced me to send my manuscript to them was the promise by the publishers that they would read the manuscript in 2 weeks and provide feedback to you. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, that's amazing. I've absolutely nothing to lose. So off it went, and a week went by, and I had an email from the publisher. Now, I should explain, Amsterdam Publishers is really a one-woman operation, an amazing woman who has committed herself and her business to publishing Holocaust and Holocaust-related memoirs, novels, and stories. And we were emailing, and she said, I think your work holds promise. And I thought, well, okay, what does that mean? So I emailed back saying, I'm not sure what you're saying, because she also provides a business helping people self-publish. So I was thinking, okay, she wants me to go the self-publishing route. That's fine. I'll just find out more about it. So after my questions, she got back to me and she said, well, why don't we have a Zoom call? I think we'll just get through the questions faster. So I said that was fine. We set up, I'm into the Zoom call, and she's taught. I honestly don't even remember what she said anymore, except at one point she said something, and she had just finished saying, I'm sure you know that this still needs a lot of editing. And I thought to myself, really? I just paid this absolutely outstanding Canadian editor who worked at McClellan Stewart for 25 years. And you're telling me it still has to be edited? And I thought, oh, okay, I'll listen to her. But then she said something about before it could be published. And I just said, okay, wait a minute. I need to understand here. Are you telling me you're going to publish this? And she looked at me like I was a dolt and said, well, yes. And I just couldn't believe it. I kept interrupting her as the conversation went on, saying, you're really going to publish this? It's, how could it be that easy? How could it be that you Google, you get this name after everything I had been reading for months? Now, I have no illusions that it can all happen that easily for anybody. In fact, even for me, I emailed her recently and said, I'm toying with the idea of writing my mother's story, and it is only in a remote kind of way through my father touching on the Holocaust. And she said, well, send it to me and we'll see. So we'll see, I guess. But
Joe, there is much more we could talk about, but we have only a very few minutes left, and I know we have some questions. So
okay,
let's hear from some people. Trish, I think you have a question or two. So if you can unmute.
While we're waiting for Trish, there are two.
Okay,
I finally found the right
there
button.
you are. Oh,
that.
perfect. Okay,
I'm
lovely.
here. Anyway,
Okay, so Trish and then Anne.
what was the most challenging part of this book writing for you? The most difficult part?
I guess the Holocaust. I didn't know
Yep.
that I had a great grandmother who was killed in Auschwitz. And
Oh,
it just, I fell apart. And finding out what had happened to my grandparents. One of my nieces is a doctor, and I asked her one day how a person dies of starvation, and wish I hadn't. So
I
they were,
agree with you.
yeah.
That does sound like a big challenge. My other question was, will there be another book?
Well, if I get the one done on Ireland and all
That's
of
about your
the,
mom?
pardon me?
That's about your mom, isn't it?
Yeah, and her family. Yeah.
Okay. So good luck with that one.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Anne, did you have a question or a comment?
Actually, no, I don't. Those were questions that were put in the chat from Trish.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. You were helping with the chat.
So we just,
Anyone else perhaps have a question or a comment for Joe? Well, then I'm going to ask that we take just 1 minute. Go ahead.
I was just going to say congratulations.
Okay,
I know
splendid.
books that I've read about the Holocaust have brought tears to my eyes. And if it were my personal family that had been through that horror, I can imagine how difficult it would be, challenging. So congratulations on what you've done.
Thank you.
Joe, we're just about at the end of our time. I wonder if you want to take just a minute or two to talk about some of the reactions you've had from people who've read your book, who've emailed you or talked with you, or in other ways talked about what happened for them as they read.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I never expected, and I am absolutely loving, is how many people are starting to talk about their past and some of their ancestors and just these incredible stories. And I always encourage people to write them if they have any interest at all in writing or recording them. And one of the things that I didn't expect out of this is how much it affected the younger people in my family. One of my nephews had been quite critical of me one time when he and my dad had come for dinner, and I just come from work and I was not in a particularly peaceful frame of mind. And my father could irritate me because at a certain point in his life, he would follow me everywhere. It was like having a puppy or a 2-year-old underfoot. And I was always afraid of stepping on him in the very small kitchen that I had at the time. And Mark said to me, "Nancy Joe, why are you being so mean to Granddad?" And it was like, whoof, getting a slap across the face. It brought me up short. So fast forward, Mark has finished reading my book and he phones me and he said, "I'm so sorry, I was so mean to you." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, Granddad was so mean to you. I understand now why you could get so irritated with him." So that certainly was funny. But I realized we're all storytellers. We all have stories to tell that we want to tell. And it's a great thing when somebody comes up and really wants to know your story and your history. And so I've had complete strangers write me these long emails about their background. They have nothing to do in common with mine, so there's no Holocaust. Some of them do have a little bit of the Irish background. But these amazing ways in which people have started talking about their past and then their interest as well in finding out something more about their family. And I would just encourage any of you who maybe have no interest at this point, but if you have older relatives that are still alive, talk to them and ask them for their stories, because I realized when it came time now to write about my mother, I was never interested in her past. I was born in Ireland. As a 7-year-old, I knew everything there was to know about Ireland. And now I think my father, at least, had written this autobiography, a lot of which was creative, let's say. I have nothing about my mother. And in the past year, I've lost 2 relatives who knew my parents, who knew my mother when she was really young. So my first cousins, who range in age from 80s to 40s, I'm busily writing up a questionnaire at this point so I can ask them. So I really encourage you, even if you think you'll never do anything with it, to find out about your family.
And I think that's a perfect place for us to stop.
Okay.
We look forward to having you with us at the book club in April, and with luck, that may be in person. Thank you so much, Joe. It's been lovely to hear about.
Really delighted. Thanks very much.
Thank you.